Most stories about monsters begin with a warning, but the story of Jeffrey Dahmer begins with silence, quiet halls, a polite smile, a neighbor who didn't make noise, didn't cause trouble, didn't draw attention. That silence is what makes this case so frightening, because the horror was not born from chaos, but from calm. When police finally stepped inside Dahmer's apartment in 1991, they didn't expect the kind of truth that freezes the air, the kind of truth that forces you to question how well you really know the person living next door. Tonight, we're going to walk through a case that still shakes people decades later, not because Dahmer was clever, but because he was invisible. As you follow this story, stay with me until the end, because the final discovery, the one officers made in the kitchen, changes everything you think you know about evil. This isn't a story of blood alone. It's the story of how a quiet man in an ordinary building held one of the darkest secrets in modern history. Jeffrey Dahmer didn't suddenly become the figure the world now fears. His darkness grew slowly, layer by layer, hidden beneath a face that rarely showed emotion. As a child, he developed a fascination with bones, not in the way kids become curious about nature, but in a way that suggested something deeper, something quietly disturbed. He often walked alone in the woods behind his home, collecting dead animals, examining them carefully as if searching for answers in the silence of lifeless bodies. Teachers described him as distant, almost unreachable, and classmates remember a boy who seemed lost long before adulthood. These early behaviors weren't recognized for what they truly were, warning signs. They were brushed aside as a strange hobby, an odd personality, nothing dangerous. But every obsession grows, and Dahmer's grew into something he could no longer hide. By the time he reached his late teens, the darkness had taken shape, pushing him toward a decision that would mark the beginning of his violent path. And the terrifying part is how easy it was for everyone around him to miss the signs. It happened almost quietly, as if even the act of murder tried to mirror Dahmer's personality. In 1978, shortly after graduating high school, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. To anyone else, it was just a ride on a warm afternoon. Dahmer offered drinks, music, conversation. Nothing threatening. But inside him, a storm was building. When Hicks tried to leave, Dahmer panicked, terrified of being abandoned, terrified of losing control. That moment of desperation became a moment of violence. A barbell, a sudden strike, and the silence that followed marked the beginning of a long, hidden nightmare. Dahmer later said he didn't plan it, but the calm way he disposed of the body suggested a much darker truth. He dissolved bones, scattered remains, and returned home as if nothing had happened. From the outside, his life looked unchanged, ordinary, forgettable. But inside, he had crossed a line he could never return from. This was the first step into a world where control, fear, and desire merged into something deadly. And from that day forward, he would spend years perfecting the mask that kept everyone fooled. By the late 1980s, Apartment 213 in Milwaukee had become the center of Dahmer's hidden world. He lived alone, surrounded by neighbors who complained occasionally about the strange, sour smell coming from his unit. Dahmer always had an excuse: a broken fridge, spoiled meat, a misunderstanding, and each excuse was accepted. Inside, however, the truth was far beyond imagination. The apartment was filled with a disturbing combination of everyday normalcy and horrifying remnants of his crimes. A small fish tank bubbled in the corner, photos were neatly arranged on shelves, and beneath that quiet domestic surface were skulls, bones, and bodies in various stages of decay. Dahmer had created a private universe where he controlled everything, and no one who entered ever left alive. He photographed his victims, preserved parts of them, and kept meticulous chilling trophies. It was a place where reality bent to his desires, where human life became an object, a possession. And all the while, the building around him carried on, people cooking dinner, watching TV and sleeping, without knowing they were living next door to a nightmare. What makes the Dahmer case so haunting isn't only what he did, but how many times he was nearly caught. Victims escaped his apartment, running into the night, desperate for help. Neighbors heard screams, smelled decay, and sensed something was wrong. Yet each time, Dahmer managed to convince police, neighbors, and witnesses that nothing unusual was happening. The most tragic example was Konorak Sinthasomphone, a young boy who actually made it outside, drugged and terrified. Neighbors called the police, begging them to intervene. But when officers arrived, Dahmer calmly explained that it was just a misunderstanding between partners. The officers believed him. They handed the boy right back into Dahmer's arms and walked away. Minutes later, Dahmer closed the door and continued the violence. These failures highlight a chilling truth. The system wasn't prepared for someone like him. His calm voice, his polite manner, his ability to lie without blinking allowed him to slip through every crack. And each missed chance meant another victim who wouldn't survive. As the years passed, Dahmer's control began to crumble. The rituals he created weren't satisfying him the way they once did. He started drinking heavily, losing track of time, forgetting simple tasks, and making sloppy decisions that should have exposed him sooner. He brought home more victims in shorter intervals, as if he feared the emptiness that came when the apartment was quiet. He stopped cleaning as carefully, stopped hiding evidence with the precision he once had. Neighbors noticed the smells growing stronger, the sounds becoming stranger. But Dahmer was no longer trying to protect his secret. His life had become a cycle he couldn't break. The trophies he kept, skulls, bones, photographs, weren't enough. He wanted total control, control that no one could challenge. And yet, beneath all the horror, he was unraveling. The loneliness he feared had become the very thing driving him deeper into violence. Each act pushed him closer to the moment everything would fall apart. And that moment came when one man finally managed to escape, not confused, not silent, but determined to survive. On July 22nd, 1991, Tracy Edwards entered Dahmer's apartment thinking it would be just a quick visit. But within minutes, he realized something was terribly wrong. Dahmer tried to restrain him, holding a knife, showing photos of previous victims as a warning. Edwards remained calm, calmer than most people could have, and waited for the right moment to escape. When he finally broke free, he sprinted down the street, flagging down two police officers who listened carefully as he described the nightmare he had just escaped. This time, the officers followed him back to apartment 213. When they opened the door, the smell hit first. Then they saw the photographs, hundreds of them, each one documenting a crime. Moments later, they found the evidence no one could argue with: skulls in drawers, a head in the fridge, and remains preserved in chemicals. The quiet man with the polite voice was exposed, his secrets scattered across the tiny apartment. Everything he had hidden for over a decade collapsed in a single night. When the world learned what Dahmer had done, the reaction was a mixture of disbelief, anger, and fear. People struggled to understand how someone so ordinary, so unremarkable, could hide such cruelty for so long. Dahmer confessed calmly, describing his actions with a chilling lack of emotion. He talked about loneliness, control, fear of abandonment, but none of it could explain the depth of his violence. He was sentenced to multiple life terms, ensuring he would never walk free again. But even prison didn't bring closure. In 1994, another inmate took his life, ending the story but not the questions. The Dahmer case forces us to confront something deeply uncomfortable. Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like the man who holds the door open, who smiles politely, who blends into the background. And that is why people still talk about him today. Not because he was brilliant, but because he was hidden in plain sight, living a double life that continues to haunt the world long after his death.